Welcome guys to the risk management video. I wanted to talk a bit about risk management and dispel any myths and just to guide and help whether you are new to cybersecurity, whether you are preparing for an interview and just wanted to better understand how organizations manage cyber risk and how to understand how we do qualitative risk analysis, how we do quantitative risk analysis, and just to get an overview of how we measure the risk, how we quantify the risk, and how organizations these days are addressing the cyber risk management. So, cybersecurity risk management is a critical process for all organizations, but can be complex and challenging. One of the biggest challenges is prioritizing risks effectively and assessing the risk's impact. Um, it normally needs some sort of calibration to understand how to calculate risks, because sometimes it can be a daunting task when we're facing a lot of risk and how we can prioritize these. After all, there are always more risks than you can address. So you need to focus on the ones that pose the biggest threats to your organization. Also, you can never close the risk. So I wanted to dispel some of the myths. So sometimes organizations feel like we put enough mitigations, so that risk is now solved. Where we can never solve the risk. You can reduce the risk to an acceptable level, but it has to be continually monitored to make sure that external and internal factors do not increase it. So how do we manage that risk? So we'll go through some of the slides that are prepared for you guys, and hopefully, explain from my perspective how cyber risk management works and how you can better understand cyber risk management. So first of all, where do we start? There are a number of methodologies and there's a number of ways that organizations can tackle cyber risk. You can, and the key point is to start with something that is for you easy to consume, easy to understand, and aligns to your organization practices. So, there are methodologies such as, NIST RMF or NIST 800-37. So, NIST Risk Management Framework, which predominantly organizations in the US use, and it's essentially a framework developed for government organizations. There's also FAIR and there's also ISO 27005. So you have to address where your organization is going to. So if you are preparing for, say, ISO 27001, it would make sense that you could use from the same organization similar principle as ISO 27005 and use that for your risk management. Because you have to understand the framework has to embed into your organizational enterprise risk management structure. So, you have to also define organization context, and that's the key point. When you walk into an organization, normally different organizations will have different risk appetite, different contexts, and different circumstances where they operate. So you have to address things like what is the regulatory environment, what industry does the business is operating in, and where they are based geographically. Because as I say, for example, things like organizations in US, they're most likely going to use NIST frameworks, whereas ISO is predominantly used around the globe, and then you can, if you want to go deep into the weeds, you can use something like FAIR. But what I mean by organization context, so imagine banks or any other highly regulated environments, they will be normally very cautious around risk because obviously there is big consequences, when risks materialize. So they have regulatory pressures to keep the risk down. So they normally will be less prone to taking risks. Whereas if you have a startup that is in a process of, and has a unique product that they try and capture as much market as possible, they might take more risks. And as they become more mature and reach a level of maturity, they will reduce the risk appetite. So it all depends on the organization context. So we also have to determine the organization's risk appetite, and it's not something that we can guess and easily measure. We just have to gauge by the context and by the business operations what is the level of risk that your organization is willing to accept. And that's the key point to determine in starting the cyber risk management. You also have to identify key management roles who will be supporting the cyber risk management. The key point where I'm trying to say here as well, that cyber risk management is not done solely by cyber team and one person alone. You have to collaborate across the organization, across the departments, to help contextualize the risks that they face and help calibrate the risk scoring. Because the more information you have, the better you can gauge the impact of the cyber risk. Sometimes it's hard to gauge that, how does this particular financial, application and the risk that is within it can, what would be the outcome or the impact of that particular risk. So having stakeholder engagement and collaboration across the departments will help you clarify and calculate and assess the impact of particular risk as well as the likelihood. Once you identify these kind of key roles, the risk appetite, and key stakeholders, there is various ways how you can get, senior stakeholder buy-in. One way organizations choose to address this is creating something like a risk committee that creates essentially a buy-in from senior stakeholders, so we can address and discuss the highest priority risks and how we're going to mitigate them, which, as I say, creates a buy-in before it goes to whether it's board or for the CEO for finalized approval, because you have the support of all the senior stakeholders and they discussed the risk management. It's also key having these meetings. They provide evidence approach of senior stakeholder engagement into cyber risk management. This is a key principle of any certification scheme that you will go. You have to evidence and you have to create policies and processes how we manage this cyber risk. The other thing is very important is you have to create asset and data inventory, because without knowing what we have, we can't address the risks. So it's the clear point of starting point is having asset inventory, your data inventory, and understanding the classification of your data and your assets. Because if you take a comparison, for example, your critical e-commerce website that generates revenue is not the same level of asset as, say, receptionist laptop. The risk on each of those assets will greatly differentiate, what's the outcome of the particular risk. So these are kind of the key areas. And then we can start into moving into completing an organization-wide risk assessment. And I'll address in the next slide how we do that. But, the key point as well is to develop an organizational strategy, how we continuously going to monitor that risk. So the whole goal is, I kind of loosely coupled it to the NIST 837, but we will discuss some of the key ideas and practices that we have to include to make sure the cyber risk management is effective. So if we move into the next slide, so how we do the cyber risk calculation and how we assess what is the most important risk. So as you can see, risk is calculated by assessing the impact and multiplying it by probability. There is various matrices you can use. You can use 3x3. This is the 5x5, as you can see an example. I believe that 5x5 gives a little bit more clarity, because 3x3 is very constituted in a small gap, so it's very hard to assess, which risk is high, medium, or low. So there's very little variance in that. So it's very important to assess the likelihood and impact of each risk. The likelihood of risk is essentially the probability that the risk will occur, whereas the impact is the severity of the consequences if it does occur. By assessing the likelihood and impact of each risk, you can get better sense of which risks are the most important to prioritize. So you can use this kind of risk scoring methodology, as you can see in the picture. So the key point is, once we evaluate the risks and we score them, so we find a risk that it's say that impact will be significant, and the probability or likelihood, it says, is almost certain. So therefore, if we multiply 5 times 3, as we can see on a matrix, the score will be very high. So therefore, as we classify all the risks from this matrix, we can create a prioritized table to see which risks are the most important for our organization. And then we can move into analysis to think how we will mitigate. The key point to mention here as well, there is a few risk mitigation tactics how we can do. We can mitigate the risk by applying controls to reduce the risk. So what we have is, when we start creating and addressing the risks, we have an inherent risk. So this is the risk that it was there to begin with. Once we apply controls, we reduce the risk, and therefore we have residual risk. The key point where sometimes people miss, and it's very key criteria to identify, is, say you have a risk of of your website being exploited or having a DDoS attack. So you might think, we will apply a control and we're going to use a firewall to reduce the risk. So once you apply the firewall, then you have a residual risk, and that residual risk might fit in within your risk appetite, and therefore you're going to move with it. But the key point is that people sometimes forget to address, you also have a control risk. So applying a firewall can create its own risk, because firewall needs to be obviously always managed. They need to be assessed, and obviously they sometimes can fail. They can create false positives and false negatives, so they come with their own risk. So you have to think about and monitor the residual risk as well as the control risk. So that's how we started. Once we move into the next stage, the key point is categorization. So we need to identify and categorize the system characteristics, and that's the key point. Sometimes organizations fail to have enough documentation, and that's the key point. We need to identify and categorize all of the systems that we have and their characteristics. We need to also identify and apply the system criticality across the enterprise systems, and also apply data categorization across a state. As I mentioned before, we might have data that includes personal identifiable information, personal health information, or even bank details. This data might be very critical. So therefore, as we apply categorization, we class this data as highly important to us, whereas something like anyone's personal data, or even something like organization structure data of each positions, it might be not as critical. So obviously, loss of each particular data or risk to particular data will vary depending on data criticality. Same goes for our systems. And obviously the key point is, and that's why I mentioned having something like risk committee that creates a buy-in. It's easier to get senior stakeholder approval for our categorization for our systems. Once we've done that, and we have all of the risks and we identify the critical risks, the next important point is, and I always like to say, there are people who like to create very difficult and very complicated risk calculations, especially in the quantitative risk analysis. I don't like starting quantitative risk analysis at the beginning, because we should only address the most critical and most important risks. And qualitative risk analysis with a matrix 5x5 is more than enough to finding out which risks are the most important. Once we qualify the most important risks, whether we apply, so risk transference we can apply, where we can create something like by cyber risk insurance policy, where we can transfer the risk to a third party, whether we apply a control and reduce the risk to an acceptable level, Or what we can also do, we can avoid the risk. So there's a particular risk, say for example, we use some legacy system that is no longer supported and it can't be patched anymore. We sometimes may avoid the risk and move the business processes into different application. So how do we do that? So the key point for me is when we address and find the most critical risks, then we calculate and we do quantitative risk analysis to measure whether mitigation or controls are in line with the risk um, exposure factor, and essentially say, so I'll give you an example. Say your organization decided to build a data center. So let's say a data center costs to build 20 million pounds. Now, if we need to address the risk of flooding to that data center, we might say if the data center floods, we have a potential exposure factor of 50%. So say we'll lose 50% of the data center. So if it's 20 million, that means the single loss expectancy, which is we multiply the asset value, which is 20 million, times exposure factors times 50%. So that means the single loss expectancy of the risk materializing is 10 million pounds. Now, if we want to apply a mitigating control, so say risk of flooding, the potential mitigating control is creating a flood guard. So then we need to calculate annualized loss expectancy. So what we do is we multiply the single loss expectancy against annual rate of occurrence. So say we did a research and we found out that the potential risk of flooding in the area we are building our data center is 1 in 100 years. So that means if we annualize that, it's 1%, or in other words 0.01. So when we calculate annualized loss expectancy, that means we multiply 10 million by 0.01, which gives us annualized loss expectancy of 100,000 pounds. And then we can measure. So say if we deploy a flood guard, we need to measure how much annualized cost with the flood guard will cost. So say if the flood guard costs for us to maintain and deploy more than 100,000 pounds a year, we would normally accept the risk because it's not worth spending more to reduce the impact of the risk than the control it costs. So that's how we do the risk calculation. So what we do, we quantify the most important risks, and then we do we do qualitative risk analysis to measure which risks are the most important to us, and then we do a quantitative risk analysis to measure whether mitigations and controls are in line for the risk exposure factor and essentially asset value. So that's how we address the risk normally. And then we move into the next stage. So that's when we do the create, we can create things like control baselines. So we can create what's the baseline of these controls. We can create system specific controls. So because obviously specific systems will have specific type of controls that they need to be applied for risk mitigation. We can also create controls for specific system components. So we can have a big system that, each component might have a different type of mitigation. So if we take something like, microservices architecture, we might apply a couple of controls to specific outcomes of it. We might apply something like web application control firewall for specific component for the ingress of traffic. We also might apply something like runtime application security controls to protect from threat actors exposing any malicious script inside our microservices architecture. The key point here as well, what we can do is we can do control tailoring. And what do I mean by that? So if we take any particular control, say we want our hard drives to be encrypted. Now say specific control from specific framework might tell you that you need to encrypt it with AES 256 encryption. But that encryption might not work in our environment. We need to make sure that it embeds to our tooling and our environment. So what we mean by control tailoring, then we would do is we apply the control as an encryption, but we might choose a different suite of encryption keys, a different framework. We might not use AES. We might use public key infrastructure. Uh, we might use, hardware security modules or software security modules. There's a few ways where we can do encryption. And the key point is, once we apply controls, then we need to create a system level continuous monitoring strategy. How do we monitor to make sure that these controls are effective as well as they are mitigating the risk to an acceptable level? Because the key point is, risk assessment or risk management is never complete. And the key point, that's why we identify the critical risks. Because normally, if you pick any regulatory requirements, they normally say you need to do a risk assessment at least annually. Yes, that's a checkbox exercise to make sure that we are running cyber risk management. But sometimes when we have a critical risks, we might do assessment quarterly or monthly to make sure that we're managing the risk effectively, as well as to the organization goals. We also need to do security control selection, designation, and allocation approved by senior stakeholders. So once we select those controls that we're mitigating the risk, we need to get a stakeholder engagement and approval that these controls are, first of all, in line with the budget spend, and they will apply enough mitigation to bring the risk to an acceptable level. So that's how we do the risk management. Once we move to the next stage, it's all about implementation. So the controls specified in the previous plans then are implemented. And the key point is, we can never do enough documentation. Once we implement the specific controls, we need to make sure we have documentation and we have change management processes of how these controls been implemented, how to maintain those controls from system level, especially for system administrators. Documentation is key. Imagine someone deployed a specific security control and that person leaves our organization. How does someone who walks into our organization can manage that control? Having the right documentation and the right processes of management of those security controls will be key into the plan succession. We need to update those documents with new controls and to monitor the system effectively. And then once we apply the controls, we update our security plans. So obviously, it's ever changing and ever evolving process of our security planning for the future engagements and future security strategy will differentiate based on the controls that we have applied. So I always say to people, we need to have a few distinct vision plans. We normally have something like 3 to 5 year strategic plan of what's our big goals and how security aligns to business goals. But then we need to have something shorter planned for whether it's 6 or 12 months to see how do we moving the needle month by month towards our strategic goals, and what do we do in terms of project planning and control implementation from day to day or month to month. And then we can do assessment. So the key point is continual assessment. So it's important to select appropriate personnel to complete the assessment. I always say to people, you can never mark your own homework. So if security is doing specific implementation of specific controls, they themselves can't be the assessor because they're marking their own homework. So it depends on organizational structure. Sometimes you will have internal audit department who can help do the assessment. Sometimes organizations will draft in external parties who are experts in assessments. And then once you have the correct personnel, then you can draft an assessment plan. So how are we going to assess? What parts of the system we're going to assess? Because sometimes, as we said in the sort of risk management, yes, we can do annual assessments of the whole system, but it's a cumbersome and long task. So sometimes we can do subsections of system where we can do quarterly assessments or even monthly assessments. And then we can assess the control's effectiveness, and that's the key point. How we address effectiveness, something like, for example, let's pick, say, say we pick something like intrusion detection system that we deployed as part of the risk mitigation, how we would assess its effectiveness. So we would compare something like false positives versus false negatives to make sure that that intrusion detection system performs effectively, and we can gauge this assessment and we can fine tune to make sure that we achieve the best return on our investment. And then we can draft, and then obviously the selected personnel can draft the assessment report, and then we can create a remediation plan for non-conforming controls. So essentially, we're trying to find how controls are effective, and the ones that do not conform to our controls or who are not effective, we can create a remediation plan that creates a continuous cycle of improvement to making sure that risks fall in line with our organization goals and risk appetite. And then we move into the last stage. So the last part of it is, how do we monitor our risks? So we monitor system and environment changes, and that's the key point, which feeds into sort of change management, and change management feeds into our risk and enterprise risk management and cyber risk management. And we make sure we monitor how system and environment changes, whether they are particular new threats that arise against our organization, and how does that affect our cyber risk management. We also plan the ongoing risk assessments. As I mentioned, there is annual risk assessments. We might do quarterly ones in the subset of the system. We can also provide the ongoing risk response. So having something like cyber risk committee or enterprise risk committee, where we can provide ongoing risk response and ongoing risk decision making, will be key to making sure our cyber risk management is effective. We also need to manage security and privacy reporting, and then essentially seek authorization changes based on continuous monitoring outputs. So whatever we determine in terms of assessments or monitoring outputs, that particular risk might not be aligning to our risk appetite, how do we manage and implement controls to make sure we bring the risk in line with our risk appetite? And then obviously this all has to be documented, because essentially normally if we look at security is a consultative function to the senior stakeholders and board of directors. So we consult them, but they have the ultimate decision power, because they are liable for the cyber risk management for the organization. So they make the final decision. We just create compelling evidence and create stories of why particular risks are very important. And then the other part is very important, is planning system disposal. As we perfectly know, when especially organizations that work in legacy environments, they have potentially legacy systems that work within cycle. So once we render that the system is no longer useful for us, we plan system disposal and how we do a system refresh in our cycle. So that's the key points, how we manage cyber risk. Hopefully you guys find it useful, and hopefully that brings some light in how organizations manage cyber risk, and hopefully that will help you to better understand how to manage cyber risk, how to calculate and quantify cyber risk, how to do cyber risk qualitative risk analysis. And yeah, if you guys would like to find out any further information, reach out on LinkedIn or provide any feedback what other topics I should address in a future series.